The Arctic wind howled through the trees, turning the frozen wilderness into an unforgiving wasteland of ice and snow. Miles from civilization, a lone hunter trudged through knee-deep drifts, searching for any sign of movement. But what he found stopped him cold. Half buried in the ice, its tiny body barely visible against the snow, a grizzly bear cub lay motionless. It should have been dead. It was frozen, its fur stiff with frost, its small paws locked in the ice. But then, its chest rose, a weak, struggling breath. The hunter's heart pounded. The cub was alive. And what happened next would shock the world. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring you more incredible true stories from the wild. The forest was eerily quiet, swallowed in the thick embrace of winter. Snow stretched for miles, untouched except for the hunter's deep boot prints carving a path through the icy wilderness. Jack Reynolds had spent his entire life in these woods, knew every ridge, every valley. But today, something felt different. The air was heavier. The silence felt wrong. He gripped his rifle tighter, adjusting the strap across his shoulder as he moved forward. Hunting in conditions like this was a challenge, but Jack had no choice. Winter was unforgiving, and food didn't wait. Then he saw it, a dark shape in the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, he thought it was just another fallen tree, buried under the weight of winter. But as he stepped closer, the outline became clearer. Small. Unmoving. Half submerged in the ice. Jack's stomach twisted. It was a bear cub. His breath hitched as he approached. The tiny creature was barely visible, trapped in a patch of ice near the edge of a frozen stream. Its fur was stiff, coated in frost. Its small paws, still too young to carry much weight, were half buried in the frozen slush. It wasn't moving. Jack knelt beside it, his fingers trembling as he reached out. Cold. Too cold. He touched its side lightly, expecting nothing. But then, a breath. So faint. So fragile. But it was there. Jack's chest tightened. The cub was alive, but barely. And out here, in this brutal wilderness, it wouldn't last much longer. He had to make a choice. If he walked away, nature would take its course. The cub wouldn't make it through the night. But if he took it with him... Jack clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the small, frozen body. The laws of nature said to leave it. But something deeper, something he couldn't explain, told him he couldn't. Lifting the cub into his arms, he felt how impossibly light it was. Too weak to fight. Too cold to react. Without another second of hesitation, Jack turned and started running. Time was against them. And so was the storm. The wind was relentless. Jack Reynolds pressed forward, his boots sinking into the thick snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The grizzly cub in his arms was frighteningly still, its tiny body frozen stiff against his chest. His jacket, wrapped tightly around it, did little to stop the icy wind from cutting through them both. The storm was closing in fast, turning the world into a blinding swirl of white. Jack's cabin was miles away, and the temperature was dropping by the minute. He didn't have time. Snow crunched beneath his hurried steps, the weight of exhaustion pressing against his shoulders. His muscles ached, but he didn't slow down. If he did, the cub wouldn't survive. His mind raced, trying to figure out what had happened. How had the cub ended up like this? Where was its mother? A cub this young shouldn't be alone. It should have been curled up in a warm den, nestled against the safety of its mother's thick fur. Instead, it had been found half buried in ice, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. Jack's grip tightened around the fragile creature. Had she left it behind? Had something happened to her? The thought made his stomach turn. A grizzly wouldn't leave her cub unless she had no choice. Another gust of wind slammed into him, nearly knocking him off balance. He gritted his teeth, pushing forward through the whiteout. His cabin wasn't far now. He just had to hold on. The cub let out a faint sound. Jack nearly stopped in shock. It was weak, barely a whisper, but it was there. A sign of life. His heart pounded harder. The cub was still fighting. "Stay with me, little guy," Jack muttered under his breath, his fingers, half numb from the cold, adjusting the cub in his arms, trying to keep it as close to his body heat as possible. He wouldn't let it die. Minutes passed like hours. Jack's lungs burned, his legs screamed for rest. But the sight of his cabin appearing through the thick snowfall gave him the push he needed. With the last of his strength, he reached the door, shoving it open with his shoulder. Warm air rushed to meet him, a stark contrast to the brutal cold outside. He kicked the door shut behind him, sealing out the storm. They had made it. But the fight wasn't over. The cub was still freezing. Jack dropped to his knees by the fireplace, moving quickly. He grabbed a thick blanket from the couch, wrapping it around the cub's frail body. Its fur was still wet, ice clinging to its small frame. It let out a soft, shivering breath. Jack swore under his breath, his mind working fast. It needed warmth. Now. He grabbed another blanket, tucking it around the cub before stoking the fire, throwing in more wood to get the flames roaring. The heat spread quickly, melting the frost from his jacket, but he barely noticed. All that mattered was the small life fighting for survival in front of him. Jack reached for a dry towel, rubbing gently over the cub's fur, trying to stimulate its circulation. Its body was still unnervingly cold. "Come on, buddy," he whispered, working carefully. "Don't give up on me." The cub stirred slightly, another faint whimper escaping its lips. Jack's chest tightened. It was responding, good. That was good. But it wasn't safe yet. Jack stood and moved to his supply shelf, grabbing a can of evaporated milk and some warm water. He poured a small amount into a cup, dipping a clean rag into the liquid before kneeling back down. He gently pressed the cloth against the cub's mouth, letting a few drops seep onto its tongue. At first, nothing happened. Then, a tiny flick of its tongue. Jack let out a slow breath, his pulse still pounding. It was weak, so weak, but it was still fighting. He sat beside the cub, leaning back against the couch, exhaustion settling into his bones. His body ached, his fingers were raw, but he didn't care. The cub's breathing was steadier now, still shallow but no longer as faint. Its small chest rose and fell against the blanket, a fragile but undeniable sign of life. Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time since he had found it in the ice, he let himself hope. Maybe, just maybe, this little one had a chance. The cabin was silent except for the faint crackling of the fire and the howling wind outside. Jack sat on the wooden floor, his back against the couch, eyes fixed on the tiny, fragile bear cub wrapped in thick blankets beside the fireplace. It had been hours since he'd pulled it from the ice, hours of rubbing warmth into its body, of feeding it tiny drops of milk, of waiting for any sign of improvement. It was still alive. But for how long? Jack had seen animals fight for survival before, had watched the brutal way nature separated the strong from the weak. Out here in the wilderness, there were no second chances. He had always lived by that rule. But this cub, this one, he couldn't let go. He reached out, brushing his fingers gently over the cub's damp fur. It felt a little warmer now, no longer like ice against his skin. That was a good sign. The cub let out the smallest whimper. Jack stilled. His heart pounded. It was the first real sound it had made since he found it, a voice, a protest, a sign that it was still here, still fighting. "You're tougher than you look," he murmured, watching as the cub stirred slightly beneath the blanket, its tiny paws twitching, a weak but undeniable movement. Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. The storm outside raged on, slamming against the cabin walls, rattling the wooden beams. It would be hours before it passed, maybe longer. There was no going anywhere. Not that he planned to. Jack stood and moved to the kitchen, pouring hot water into a metal pot and placing it near the fire to warm the room further. He grabbed a dry towel and gently rubbed it over the cub's fur, trying to stimulate circulation. The cub flinched slightly but didn't resist. Good. That was good. Its eyes were still closed, its breathing still shallow, but something had changed. It was no longer lifeless. Jack sat back down, watching the flames flicker in the fireplace, exhaustion pressing against his shoulders. He had spent the last few hours doing everything he could, but what happened next wasn't up to him. His mind drifted back to the question that had been gnawing at him since he found the cub: where was its mother? A cub this young wouldn't survive alone. It wasn't old enough to be without her. That meant one of two things: she had been killed, or she had been forced to leave it behind. Neither option sat well with him. If she was out there, still searching for her cub. Jack clenched his jaw. Would she come back? And if she did, what then? The thought made his stomach twist. A mother bear separated from her cub was dangerous. Desperate. If she realized a human had taken it, there was no telling what she would do. Jack had dealt with grizzlies before, had seen firsthand what they were capable of. One swipe of her paw could kill him instantly. But still, he glanced down at the cub, its tiny body rising and falling steadily now. It was alive because of him. He sighed, shaking his head. That was a problem for later. Right now, there was only one thing that mattered. He wasn't going to let this little one die. The storm had finally begun to ease, but the wind still howled through the trees, shaking the cabin walls. Jack sat near the fireplace, watching the cub's slow, steady breathing. It was still weak, still fragile, but it had made it through the night. That alone was a small miracle. Jack sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. He was exhausted, his body aching from the hours spent tending to the cub. But sleep wouldn't come. His mind was racing. Something wasn't sitting right. The cub had been too far from any den, too exposed. Grizzlies didn't abandon their young unless something forced them to. If the mother was alive, she would still be searching. And if she was searching, she wouldn't stop until she found him. Jack pushed himself up from the floor, stretching out his stiff limbs. He needed to check outside. He hadn't left the cabin since he'd carried the cub inside, and if there was even a chance the mother bear was nearby, he had to know. He grabbed his rifle, slinging it over his shoulder. Not because he wanted to use it, but because he knew what a desperate mother was capable of. The door creaked open, letting in a blast of icy air. Jack squinted against the morning light, stepping out onto the small porch. The storm had left the world untouched, the fresh snow stretching in all directions. The wind had covered his tracks from the night before. But he wasn't alone. There, at the edge of the trees. Tracks. Massive paw prints. Fresh. Jack's pulse quickened. She was here. He scanned the tree line, his breath visible in the cold air. The forest was silent now, eerily so, as if holding its breath. Then, movement. A shadow among the trees. Jack's fingers tightened around the strap of his rifle, but he didn't raise it. He just watched. The bear stepped forward, her dark eyes locked onto him. She was huge, thick with winter fur, powerful, her breath heavy in the frozen air. But she didn't charge. She didn't growl. She just stood there, watching him. Jack swallowed hard. He knew what she wanted. She wanted her cub. His chest tightened as he glanced back toward the open cabin door. The cub was still inside, still too weak to move. Jack turned back to the mother bear, his mind racing. If he gave it back now, would it survive? If he kept it, would she wait? The wind howled between them, filling the silence. Jack's heart pounded. He had to decide. The mother bear didn't move. Jack stood frozen on the porch, his breath slow and controlled, his fingers twitching slightly against the rifle strap slung over his shoulder. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, his instincts screaming at him to back away. But the bear wasn't charging. She just watched him. The space between them was filled with tense, fragile silence, only broken by the soft howling of the wind. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the untouched snow, making the bear's massive form look even more imposing. Her fur was dusted with frost, her deep brown eyes locked onto his. She wasn't just any bear. She was a mother. And she had come for her cub. Jack glanced back at the open cabin door. Inside, near the warmth of the fire, the tiny grizzly cub lay curled up, barely stirring. It was still weak, still vulnerable. If he gave it back now, would it even survive the brutal cold? The mother took a step forward, her enormous paws pressing deep into the snow. Jack stiffened but didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't want this to end in violence. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to think clearly. If he hesitated too long, she might force his hand. Jack had seen what a desperate bear could do. A mother defending her cub had strength beyond reason, beyond fear. One wrong move, and she would tear through him like paper. But something about her posture, her eyes, made him pause. She wasn't roaring. She wasn't showing her teeth. She was waiting. And in that moment, Jack made a decision. He turned his back on her. Every instinct screamed against it, but he forced himself to step inside the cabin, leaving the door open. If she wanted to attack, he had just given her the perfect opportunity. But she didn't. She let him go. Jack knelt beside the cub, its tiny body still wrapped in blankets, its breath slow but steady. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly over its fur. It was warmer now, stronger than before. But not ready. Jack exhaled. He wasn't sure how, but he knew the mother bear understood. She had trusted him before, trusted him enough to leave her cub in his hands. And now, he was asking her to trust him again. Slowly, carefully, he reached for another thick blanket and wrapped the cub gently inside. Its small body stirred, letting out a faint whimper, but it didn't resist. Jack lifted it into his arms. The mother bear let out a low, deep rumble from outside, a sound filled with longing. Jack stepped back out onto the porch, his breath hitching as he met her gaze once more. The moment stretched between them, heavy, unspoken. Then, taking the greatest risk of his life, Jack did something no one else would dare to do. He stepped forward. The world around him felt frozen in time. Jack took slow, careful steps down from the cabin porch, the small grizzly cub wrapped tightly in his arms. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than the snow beneath his boots. His breath came in steady puffs, curling into the cold air, his body tense with a fear he couldn't afford to show. The mother bear watched his every move. Her massive frame stood just beyond the clearing, her deep, dark eyes locked onto the bundle in his arms. She let out a low, guttural huff, her breath rising like mist in the frigid morning air. She wasn't attacking. She wasn't running. She was waiting. Jack's grip on the cub tightened instinctively, but he forced himself to stay calm. Every part of him screamed that this was a mistake, that he was too close, too exposed, too vulnerable. But another part, something deeper, something primal, told him this was the only way. The cub whimpered softly against his chest. The sound made the mother bear tense, her ears twitching, her massive paws shifting in the snow. Jack saw the conflict in her posture, the unbearable pull of her instincts to rush forward and take her baby back, against the hesitation of being so close to a human. She was fighting the same battle he was. Jack took another slow step forward. The space between them was vanishing. 10 feet. 7 feet. 5. The mother let out another deep breath, this one softer. Not a growl. Not a warning. Something else. Something that almost sounded like relief. Jack's pulse thundered in his ears. This was it. He knelt down, his knees pressing into the frozen ground. His hands were steady, but his entire body was tight with tension as he lowered the cub into the snow. The mother bear let out a deep, aching groan, a sound so filled with emotion that it sent a shiver down Jack's spine. She took a cautious step forward. Jack didn't move. His heart pounded as she closed the distance, her powerful muscles shifting beneath her thick fur. One swipe of her paw could end him, but she didn't attack. She stopped just a breath away, lowering her massive head, sniffing, watching. The silence of the forest was overwhelming. The wind had stopped howling, leaving behind a quiet, unnatural stillness. Jack stood motionless, his breath still visible in the cold air, his body frozen in place. His eyes were locked on the tree line where the mother bear had disappeared with her cub. He had done it. The little grizzly cub was safe. The mother had taken it, and they were no longer trapped in the wilderness together. Jack didn't know where they would go or how they would survive the rest of the harsh winter, but in that moment he didn't care. The connection they had forged had been enough. They had both made it through something life-altering. Jack slowly turned back toward the cabin, his body heavy with the weight of the ordeal. The warmth inside seemed like a distant memory. There was still a deep emptiness inside him, a hollow ache in his chest that wasn't physical but something else, a mixture of grief, relief, and uncertainty. The cub, which had been his responsibility for a short while, was now back with its mother. Jack had given it back. He had let it go. But the question lingered, what had this experience really meant? The air inside the cabin was warmer than the biting cold outside, but Jack could feel the chill of the wilderness still lingering within him. He couldn't shake the feeling of watching that mother bear leave with her cub, of standing there knowing that their story had ended, at least for now. He glanced around the cabin, the remnants of the storm still clinging to the windows. The fire in the hearth had faded to embers, its warmth just a distant memory. The blanket where the cub had spent the night was now neatly folded at the edge of the room, untouched. The once fragile life he had carried was no longer here. It felt as though time had paused. Had he made the right choice? Jack walked over to the window, looking out into the wilderness. The trees stood tall and silent, the snow gently falling once again as if the storm hadn't passed at all. He knew that there would be no answers. There was no rulebook for moments like this, no guide to tell him whether he had done the right thing by intervening, by taking the cub into his cabin, by keeping it warm. The mother bear had trusted him. She had come back. And in the end, she had taken her cub away with her, just as nature intended. He had given the cub the chance it deserved, and for that, Jack felt a deep sense of pride. But there was also something else. Something he hadn't expected. The bond he had formed with that little cub. The feeling of holding something so small, so fragile, something that had needed him in that exact moment, in that exact place. Jack let out a slow breath, his fingers pressing against the cold window pane. He realized then that this moment, this experience, would stay with him forever. The wild was beautiful and cruel, but it had shown him something he had never fully understood before. He wasn't just a man in the wilderness trying to survive. He had become part of the wilderness, part of the cycle of life that was so much bigger than him, bigger than any human intervention. Jack had given the cub a fighting chance, and in return, he had been gifted a piece of the wild that no one else would ever understand. He turned away from the window, his eyes scanning the empty room. The silence now felt peaceful. The tension had dissolved. The mother bear and her cub were out there, free in the wild where they belonged. Jack slowly made his way to the table, sitting down heavily. He poured himself a drink, staring into the amber liquid for a long moment. The taste was sharp, biting, but it was real. It was the taste of survival. As he finished his drink, Jack stood up, grabbed his jacket, and made his way outside once again. This time, he wasn't chasing after anything. He wasn't running toward a decision that would change everything. Instead, he walked slowly through the snow-covered ground, letting the quiet of the wilderness wash over him. The mountains stood tall in the distance, endless and imposing. The trees loomed, their branches swaying in the light breeze. It was as if the entire world had returned to its natural state, untouched and perfect in its own way. Jack looked out into the horizon. The mother and cub had gone. They had found their place in this vast world. And Jack had found his, too. This journey wasn't just about survival. It was about trust, sacrifice, and the bond between man and the wild. Jack's decision to help the grizzly bear cub was a reminder that sometimes the wild calls for us to act, no matter the risk. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with someone who believes in the power of nature and the beauty of unexpected connections. Comment below, what would you have done in Jack's place? How far would you go to save a life, no matter how small? Don't forget to turn on notifications to be the first to experience more powerful real-life stories that show the true spirit of survival and compassion. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Until next time, stay connected with the wild.